Now, before the Revolution of 1776, America had been merely a collection of disparate British colonies composed of some 2 million subjects or so, huddled along a narrow strip of the Atlantic coast, European outposts, if you will, 3,000 miles from the center of civilization and the center of the empire. By 1815, following a second war with Great Britain, often called by the Americans themselves as the Second War of Independence, these insignificant provinces had become a single giant continental republic with nearly 10 million citizens, many of whom had already spilled into the lands beyond the Appalachian Mountains. And the cultural focus of this new, huge, expansive nation was no longer abroad towards Europe or England, but was instead directed inward at its own boundless possibilities. Now, Americans knew right from the outset in 1776 that they were a grand experiment in democracy. Lincoln didn't get that idea himself. He's drawing on the Revolution, that this was the great hope. The first person to use that term was Jefferson. America's the great hope for democracy. It's Lincoln who said the last great hope. But Americans were nonetheless confident that they could, by their own efforts, remake their culture. In fact, I think that's at the heart of the Enlightenment. It's the sudden sense that people have in the 18th century that culture, which we now take for granted, could be created. You could remake yourself. You could remake your society. And that is what leads to all of the progressive reforms that come out of the Enlightenment. So people were now filled with this notion that they could recreate what they thought and believed. The Revolution told them that people's birth did not limit what they might become, that who your father was did not matter. That's what the heart of republicanism was repudiation of blood, if you will. And hence the importance they gave to education. And I think you have the greatest flowering of writings on education than at any time in our history, especially if you consider per capita. Now, a lot of the educational schemes they came up with didn't get implemented by that generation. It took another generation into the 1830s and 40s to transform what they thought about. Jefferson was only one among many who essentially created our three-tiered system of elementary school, what they call grammar school, high school, and then university training. They had all kinds of plans for that, Jefferson's being the most famous. And it gets implemented in the next generation, but the writings are all laid out by this revolutionary generation. Suddenly, everything seemed possible. The leaders were faced with this awesome task of creating out of their British heritage their own separate national identity. Now, that's not an easy thing to do, and that's a major problem through this whole period. How do British people become Americans? And they wrestle with that through all these decades. They couldn't even decide on a name for themselves. Some of them suggested Columbia. Columbia seemed to be a good one because it had the same rhythm and number of syllables as Britannia. Therefore, you could just substitute into all of the English songs where Britannia was used, you could substitute Columbia. And of course, Columbia, this coincided with the tercentenary of Columbus's discovery of America, so there's a lot of talk about Columbia, and you see a lot of that remaining in our own time, but nonetheless, it didn't stick. Samuel Mitchell suggested Fredonia. He was a doctor and later senator from New York. And Fredonia, he said, we're Fredonians and so on. I think the only thing I know how that stuck was that the Marx Brothers picked it up and used it in one of their shows. But it didn't stick either, and so we remained Americans, usurping the title that really belonged to the whole people of the whole hemisphere. North and South, and the United States of America, and that was the title we had. The reason that impressment, which is the pressing of sailors, the British practice of stopping an American merchant ship and investigating the sailors to find out how many of them were British subjects and removing those subjects for their own ships. They needed at least in the Napoleonic Wars, they needed about 10,000 sailors a year to recruit for their navy. They had the largest navy in the world. And of course, about 30% of the American merchant marine was made up of British subjects who had jumped ship. So the Brits had a real complaint. And of course, since the men looked the same, talked the same, it was often difficult to say who's an American, who's not. In some sense, that issue of impressment became the single most important element, factor in James Madison calling, President Madison calling for the declaration of war against Britain in 1812.